Well, welcome to those who are watching this video on elementary symbolic logic, symbolization. Especially like to welcome my students from Methodist University. This is from a course called Symbolic Logic, which deals with what we sometimes call, probably shouldn't call it that, baby logic. And we're dealing with deductive logic. Now, deductive logic assesses arguments that claim that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That's the definition of deductive validity. A deductive argument is valid if and only if, when the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Otherwise, it's invalid. That's different, of course, from soundness. A sound argument is valid and has true premises, though you can have an unsound argument that's valid. Now, we're dealing with just a logical structure. We're dealing with the formal level of statements in our languages that we speak, English, German, French, etc. So we could strip away these natural languages from statements. We might be able to understand better their formal logical structure. That's the reason we symbolize statements. I'm going to go over the vocabulary of symbolization. Individual units are symbolized by capital letters from A through Z. Try using the first letter of a key word in the sentence. You may have to vary sometimes later on when you have a proof that has more than one statement. Right, you're going to have, let's say, 3 or 4 premises and then a conclusion. Sometimes, if you're symbolizing, you may have to vary in how you symbolize. Let's say you have a statement: Carl goes to the store and Kathy went back home. Well, you don't want to use C for both of them, so you just pick a different letter. But look at these examples here. John went to the store can be symbolized as J. I just use the first name for John. That doesn't mean I have to use that letter, but usually I will, if you're dealing with names, deal with the main subject of a statement. Her car died can be symbolized as C. Connectives or operators are symbols for words that combine and or change the logical structure of statements. They include words like not, and, or, if then, and only if then. So let's take a look at how these are symbolized one by one. First, we have the tilde. I sometimes call it the wiggle because Bowman Clark, who was one of my professors at the University of Georgia, always called it the wiggle. This symbolizes words like not and not, it is not the case that, and other synonyms of the word not. Here's some examples. David is not the butler. Well, if we symbolize David is the butler by D, David is not the butler will be wiggle D, and you put the wiggle before the capital letter. It is not the case that Benjamin Franklin was President of the United States. Well, if you use B for Benjamin Franklin was President of the United States, to symbolize it is not the case that, you again use a wiggle before the B. That was the simplest of all the connectives that we use. Now, the dot is the beginning of what we call binary connectives, or connectives that require at least 2 units to join together. The dot symbolizes words like and, but, both, and, however, nevertheless, semicolon if it's dividing 2 complete thoughts. In other words, we're talking about coordinating conjunctions. So here's some examples. Mary is sick, but Jane will go to the party. I'll correct myself there. There should be a comma after Mary is sick. This would be symbolized M.J. M for Mary is sick, J for J will go to the party, and the dot in between to symbolize the and. You never have a dot with a letter by itself. It's always combining at least 2 units. So if you had dot before M and nothing else, that would be what we call something that's not a formula, right? And while M.J is something we sometimes call a well-formed formula or whiff. Second example, IBM is a healthy company, but Apple's stock has not increased in price lately. Well, IBM is a healthy company is I, Apple stock has increased in price lately is A, and you have the but there that's going to be symbolized with the dot. And don't forget the not in the second unit there. Apple stock has not increased. You still have to symbolize that. So that's going to be symbolized I dot wiggle A. Moving on to the wedge. The wedge symbolizes or, either or. It also symbolizes the word unless. So when you see the word unless, you can kind of pretend it's an or and just put the wedge there. So a couple of examples here. Either Kroger will purchase Harris Teeter or Harris Teeter's profits will drop. So K for Kroger will purchase Harris Teeter. H for Harris Teeter's profits will drop. That's going to be symbolized as K wedge H. Again, you cannot have something like wedge H by itself. A wedge has to connect two units. Second example, Susan will attend the meeting unless Bill comes. S for Susan will attend the meeting. B for Bill comes. That's S wedge B. The horseshoe is probably one of the most difficult symbols when it comes to symbolizing statements, and we'll go over some of the reasons later. But the horseshoe symbolizes if then, only if then, provided that, given that, implies that. And there's some other things that it symbolizes as well that you might see from time to time. And as you meet them in the textbook, for those of who are my students, we'll go over them. So here's a couple of simple examples. If it is raining, the streets will be wet. Well, if it is raining as R, and the streets will be wet as S, then that is symbolized R, horseshoe S. And note, we don't worry about tenses in this logic. Whether a statement is in present, past, or future tense does not matter at this logic. There are some attempts to develop temporal logics which try to deal with tenses, but in elementary logic we don't. James will come as J. Michael stays home as M. Now that is symbolized M horseshoe J. You may ask why, since the if is in the middle of the sentence. It doesn't matter. Michael stays home is the unit that goes with the if. And the unit, the part that goes with the if, always goes to the left of the horseshoe if you just had the word if. See, what it's really saying is if Michael stays home, then James will come. So it has to be symbolized in that order. If you had J horseshoe M, it would be wrong because you're not dealing with logically equivalent statements. One of the more difficult issues of symbolization for a lot of students with the horseshoe is symbolizing necessary and sufficient conditions. A condition is necessary if it must take place in order for another event to take place. It may or may not be sufficient also. Let's take the statement, oxygen is a necessary condition for fire. Well, oxygen is necessary for a fire to occur. You have to have oxygen to have a fire. But it's not sufficient for a fire to occur. We certainly hope not. Otherwise, the entire planet would be burning. You have to have something else. Somebody strikes a match, lightning strikes, something starts a fire. So it's only a necessary condition. Now, a condition is sufficient just in case if it takes place, another event will always follow. So here's an example. Being crushed under 1,000 pounds of concrete is a sufficient condition for the death of the human organism. All right, and we're not going to go into any exceptions like the concrete breaks and it goes around the person. It doesn't really hit the person. If you have 1,000 pounds of weight that actually hits you and you're crushed under it, you are not going to live. So we're talking about a sufficient condition. Now, how are sufficient conditions symbolized? A sufficient condition is always stated to the left of a horseshoe. A necessary condition is always stated to the right of the horseshoe. So in an if-then statement, you have if, sufficient condition, then a necessary condition. Now the thing that gets tricky is the only ifs. Only if introduces a necessary condition, then the sufficient condition. So it reverses the order of how you symbolize. While the part of the statement with the if always goes to the left in a regular if-then statement, in an only if-then statement, the part with the only if goes to the right. So let's take a look at these examples. If Fiat designs a new hybrid, so will Honda. Fiat designs a new hybrid is F, Honda is H, so F horseshoe H is non-problematic there. Fiat designing a new hybrid is a sufficient condition for Honda doing so. And although it sounds a little funny, Honda designing a new hybrid is a necessary condition for Fiat doing so. We don't capture every way we use language with our symbolic logic, only some of the ways. So there's going to be a little bit of awkwardness there. All right, second example, Honda designs a new hybrid if Fiat does. That's symbolized exactly the same way as the previous example because the part with the if goes to the left. The part with the if is always a sufficient condition and they always go to the left. However, look at this example. Fiat designs a new hybrid only if Honda does. Well, note the only if introduces a necessary condition, so the part with the only if goes to the right of the horseshoe and not to the other side. All right, and you'd be wrong if you put it on the other side. So if you can remember that only if reverses the order, then you shouldn't have too much problem putting these the right way. Here's some examples of other horseshoe symbolizations. The Democrats will win the election provided that the economy improves. Well, provided that is like an if. All right. So what it's saying is if the economy improves, the Democrats will win the election, and that, of course, would be symbolized E horseshoe D with the E to the left. Right, the part with the provided that, since it's an if, introduces a sufficient condition, is always to the left of the horseshoe. Second example, the Republicans will win the election on condition that they bring out their base. Well, on condition that is like an if. All right, so that's going to be a sufficient condition. Bringing out their base goes to the left, and then Republicans winning the election, when the election goes to the right. All right, don't let the order of the English fool you. Given that there are questions about Mr. Obama's Middle Eastern policy that will cost him some popularity in the polls. Well, given that it's like an if, so what it's really saying is if there are questions about Mr. Obama's Middle Eastern policy, that will cost him some popularity in the polls, so that's symbolized Q, horseshoe C. Libertarians willing more votes implies that they are getting their message across. Implies that you just go into the order of the English. Libertarians willing more votes goes to the left. Whatever's after implies that goes to the right. And that makes it a lot easier. Where you have the implies that, you might draw a little horseshoe over it, and then you got the right order already there in your English sentence. The conditional, and I'm sure you're thoroughly tired of it by now, going to the triple bar. The triple bar symbolizes if and only if, IFF, which means if and only if. All right, that was not a misspelling. That is a way that, particularly in math, you might see this. Sometimes I'll use it in a logic class, but it means if and only if. Just in case, or necessary and sufficient condition for. All right, the triple bar deals with necessary and sufficient conditions. I'll give an example here. A man is a bachelor if and only if he's an unmarried adult male. Well, the man being a bachelor is necessary and sufficient for him being an unmarried adult male. And a man being an unmarried adult male is both necessary and sufficient for him being a bachelor. So we use the triple bar, B triple bar U. The order technically doesn't matter. I prefer you to go in the order of the English sentence, but U triple bar B is logically equivalent to B triple bar U, and I will not count off any points on an exam if you write something logically equivalent to the correct answer, even if you do it by accident. All right, Mary will leave just in case Sue stays. That's M triple bar S. Or Kroger will make a profit just in case it makes more money than it spends. K triple bar M. Very important concepts to get down, the scope and main connective. Now, the main connective or main operator, that concept is in your textbook, Methodist students, but scope is not, and I found it to be a very useful concept. The scope of a connective is the connective itself and whatever it connects. So in the statement, A dot wiggle B. What's the scope of the wiggle? Well, it negates the B, so the scope is going to be wiggle B. The scope of the dot is going to be A dot wiggle B because it connects the A and the wiggle B together. So the scope of the dot is the whole thing. Now we name the statements after the main connective. So the main connective is a dot, as it is in this case. That is called a conjunction. The main connective is a wiggle, then we call it a negation. If the main connective is a horseshoe, we call it a conditional statement. If the main connective is a biconditional, a triple bar, we call it a biconditional. Okay, and if the main connective is a wedge, we call it a disjunction. So they're named after the main connective. The main connective has the largest scope. All right, obviously the main connective is the dot, since it connects more than any other in that particular statement. Let's look at a longer example. Wiggle, brackets, A, wedge, wiggle, parentheses, wiggle, B, horseshoe, C, close parentheses, close brackets. Moving from left to right, the scope of the first wiggle is the whole thing. Right, it includes the wiggle outside plus what it connects. Well, it's a unary connective, right? The wiggle just negates one item, and the item is everything inside the brackets. So the wiggle is the connective with the largest scope and is therefore the main connective. The scope of the wedge is A or wiggle, parentheses, wiggle B, horseshoe C, close parentheses. And actually, I do not need the brackets there, and I should not have had the brackets there. But I'm not going to do this over again. Just remember, if there's no ambiguity, you want to avoid ambiguity in logic. You want to know what each connective connects. But if you don't have ambiguity, you need to get rid of these grouping indicators, and in this case, the brackets. The scope of the second wiggle is wiggle, parentheses, wiggle B, horseshoe C. The scope of the third wiggle is wiggle B, and the scope of the horseshoe is wiggle B, horseshoe C. So you might look at some of the statements in the textbook and play around with some of those. Now, some symbolizations are a little more complicated, but we can look to the English grammar to figure out the best way to symbolize them. IBM will grow, comma, and Apple will invent a new device, or Microsoft will design a new operating system. Now, I pronounced it that way on purpose. IBM will grow sets aside that part from the rest of the statement. So IBM will grow, and what? And that or statement there. Apple will invent a new device, or Microsoft will design a new operating system. The parentheses have to go to the right in that case. So I dot parentheses A wedge M. If you had the parentheses on the other side, it would not be logically equivalent to I dot A wedge M. All right, the parentheses have to be on that particular side, or it's wrong. All right, another example. IBM will grow and Apple will invent a new device, comma, or Microsoft will design a new operating system. Well, there the comma comes after the and statement. So IBM will grow and Apple will invent a new device. So that's separate. That's symbolized as I dot A in parentheses, or what? Or Microsoft will design a new operating system, or M. Now, do we always have commas to give us clues? Not necessarily. Now, here's another one with a comma. All right, another two with a comma. God exists, or everything is permitted, and there is no meaning in life. That's symbolized G, or parentheses P dot wiggle M. The comma after God exists sets that G apart from the rest of the statement. So the parentheses have to be where they are. God exists, or everything is permitted, comma, and there is no meaning to life. G, wedge P, in parentheses, dot, not M. And it can't be symbolized with the parentheses to the right. They have to be to the left. Now, here's some that do not have commas, and that gets a lot harder, doesn't it? Both Kroger and Harris Teeter will merge, or their stockholders will rebel. The both and should clue you into where the parentheses will go. Both Kroger and Harris Teeter will merge, K.H in parentheses, or their stockholders will rebel, or S. The parentheses have to go to the left with the K.H. Kroger will make a profit, And Harris Teeter will grow, or Food Line will take over Lowe's Foods. Kroger will make a profit set aside from the rest, so that's K, and then, and what? Well, Harris Teeter will grow, Food Line will take over Lowe's Foods, H or F in parentheses. Okay, let's deal with some either-or statements and similar statements to those. Neither John nor Mary is going to the party. A neither-nor statement is usually symbolized with a wiggle on the outside, then parentheses, J wedge M. Another way to correctly symbolize this statement is not J dot, not M. Those two statements are logically equivalent, and when we get to truth tables very soon now, we will show you why they're logically equivalent. Note, not parentheses, J dot M, close parentheses, is incorrect. Okay, that would actually be equivalent to not J or not M, and that's not what that statement above is saying. John and Mary are not going to the party is saying John is not going to the party and Mary is not going to the party, or not parentheses, J wedge M. All right, again, not parentheses, J dot M, close parentheses, is incorrect. Apple stock will fall, or Craze computers will not sell. Not A wedge, not C. Apple stock will not fall, or Craze computers will not sell, and that's equivalent to not parentheses, A dot C. Note, not A dot, not C is incorrect. Well, thank you for bearing with me in this lesson on symbolization. I hope that you find it helpful. What I would suggest in the book in Chapter 6 on the symbolizations is that you just start and try the first 10 or 15. And in the next online session, I will have the answers to those questions for you.